Hi, my name is Brett, and this is episode 2 of Test-Driven RSpec, a series where we learn about doing test-driven development with RSpec. In this episode, we're going to be testing a simple Rails API that returns JSON with RSpec request specs. So right now, this application is just a new Rails app using the latest version, 5.1.4, and it's also using RSpec Rails 3.6.1. This should work with the Rails 5 series and RSpec 3 series, and none of it is using particularly new functionality. It's just a lot of the fundamentals. So there's no controllers, no models, no tests yet. We're going to start by writing our first test. And for a RSpec test that tests the API, we're going to create it in the request directory. So if we do spec make dir spec requests, that's where this will live, and RSpec will be able to infer that it's a request spec because it's in the request directory. So go ahead and we'll create that first test, and we're going to just make a really simple API endpoint that returns status OK to let us know that the API is working. So if you go to spec requests, we're going to call it status spec.rb. We'll require the Rails helper because we want to test the full stack of the Rails app to make sure it's working. So that includes the extra functionality in RSpec Rails instead of just normal RSpec. And we're going to do RSpec.describe. For request specs, I usually like to do a namespace of like status requests for the top level describe because we're not actually testing a class, we're testing a full functionality. And we'll do a describe for that specific HTTP request. I title these as the HTTP method get, and then the path to the endpoint, so /status. And we're going to say it returns a status message. And we'll write our first test with RSpec, making HTTP methods. There's actually methods for each of the HTTP methods, so you can just call get, and then the path that we're going to call it, make the request at, which is status. And then we're going to take the response and parse it as JSON, or parse the JSON into a hash in Ruby. So we'll just call this, we'll call it response, or we'll call it, let's call it JSON is equal to JSON.parse response.body. So RSpec gives you response, and part of response is the response.body, and it's going to be in JSON. So what we do is we parse it with JSON.parse, and that'll return a hash in Ruby, which we can use to easily access and test against. Then we're going to say expect the JSON to have a status attribute, and we're going to say to equal OK. So it'll return this simple, status OK kind of object. That's our goal, so that if we had an uptime monitor or just something to check that the API is working, it's a place to start. So we'll go ahead and we'll run this test. It should fail because it's our first test. Something really quick worth noting is that bin/RSpec is available in Rails apps. You have the bin directory, which is just a quicker way of, instead of having to write bundle exec to make sure it uses the right RSpec or the right plugin or the right gem, you just do bin/RSpec and it uses that bin stub. And if you don't have the bin stub for your app, you can do, I think it's bundle bin stubs generate. There's a command to do it. So we have our first failure, which is great. Always the first step in test-driven development. We have no route matches get/status. Now, why is this? If we go ahead and we open config routes in a new tab, we'll see that there's actually no routes defined. So our first step to change this test failure message would be to define our first route, and we're just going to call it status, and we're going to map it to a status controller with the index action, just to follow normal Rails conventions. Run the test again. Should fail again, but we'll have a different failure. This time our failure is action controller routing error, uninitialized constant status controller. That's because this GET request is trying to map the request to the status controller, which doesn't exist yet. So, just using regular test-driven development, we'll go ahead and try to make the failure change by creating a status controller. And we'll define that status controller as controller that inherits from application controller, which is the default Rails controller that most controllers can inherit from. Run the test again. Failure now is different, saying the action index cannot be found for the status controller. Great, we're making progress. If we do def index for that action, run the test again. Great, so now we have a different failure, and it's actually hitting the full stack of the Rails app. And it's saying that action controller unknown format status controller index is missing a template for this request. And that's because by default, the application is going to try to respond with HTML, but we're going to actually make it respond with JSON. So we can call render, which is Rails controller action method, and we're going to say JSON. And then we can actually just pass the JSON that we want to render. And this will hopefully make our test pass because we're now returning JSON. Run the test again, and it passes. So that's a really quick full stack test of a Rails app to go from seeing that it's working to making the request to parsing the response body and making sure it's okay. Another thing that you can test in your request spec that's nice is the response.status, which returns an HTTP status code. And I think it should be 204. Run the tests again. And we failed. It's actually a 200. So run the test again. 200 is what we want. I just had it wrong. So there we go. We're testing that it's returning a 200, which is good to know. And we're testing that the status object is returning okay. So we have our first test with the request spec. Now, let's say we wanted to do something a little more complex where we're sending parameters along with the request. Let's go ahead and create a new request spec. And this little application will return video game consoles, an array of video game consoles. And we'll add support for filtering those consoles by their manufacturer, let's say. So if we do spec requests and we'll call it consoles spec, start again by requiring the Rails helper, RSpec describe. Same deal again. We'll call this consoles requests. Did I make that plural? Yeah. So consoles requests. We'll do describe get consoles, let's say, and we'll say it returns an array of video game consoles. For this, we will do get consoles. We'll parse the response body again, so we'll do JSON equals JSON.parse response.body. And if you notice, oh yeah, this seems kind of tedious that we're doing this over and over for every request, we'll actually pull this out into a module at the end of this episode and make that module available in all of our specs so that it is easy to take the JSON response and test against it. And we're going to say we're going to expect the JSON consoles object to contain exactly, which is an RSpec method for testing that certain objects are included. And then I'll just list out a bunch of video game consoles. Did I spell Genesis right? Yeah, I did. Genesis, we'll do Xbox, we'll do Switch, we'll do PS1, PS2. There's enough to get us started, let's say. So if we go ahead and rerun that test, it's going to fail, right? Because we don't have that consoles endpoint. Going back to routes again, we'll do consoles and we'll map it to consoles index. Run it again. It's going to fail again. We'll create our consoles controller. We'll inherit it from application controller again. I could copy and paste, but I like retyping it all because I just get more familiar with it each time. And yeah, you learn a little bit more about what's all happening. So I kind of jumped the gun there by writing index, but we'll delete that and just do it the true TDD way. Define it, run it again. It's going to fail. Fails because we're not actually returning anything. And then we could do render JSON consoles. And we're going to make it that object look like this. And we'll define the consoles array above. Now imagine, you could do console.all and if you were using models, but we're not going to actually touch models here because it's not work with it. But let's just say we had console as a model. You do console.all. But for us, we're just going to do consoles and we're going to make it an array. And this is kind of cheating because it's, this example, but I'm just going to copy and paste the consoles I listed here. And then we'll go ahead and we'll run that again. It passes, which is great. So now we're rendering this array of consoles. If you wanted to test that, a certain subset was included, like let's just say it returns an array of, some consoles. Instead of contain exactly, and just a quick aside on contain exactly, it's nice because it doesn't care about order. It just cares that those objects are included in the array. So if you're just testing, this collection includes these objects, contain exactly is really nice. You could also do it include, so you could do to include, and we'll just do a subset of those. And then we'll run it again, and that should pass. So yeah, that array of consoles includes NES and SNES. Save it again. We'll undo it because I like contain exactly because it's testing it as we want. And so with that working, let's do a little change to our consoles, and we'll make it a bunch of data structures where we each console has a name and a manufacturer. So that would be Nintendo, right? We'll make this with the name SNES. Do manufacturer Nintendo. Do name is a Wii, and the manufacturer is also Nintendo. For the Sega Genesis, it'll be Sega. For Xbox, it'll be Microsoft. For the Switch, it'll be also Nintendo. And the reason why I've got so many Nintendo is because we'll just show you for the next test example, but manufacturer, Nintendo. Got a typo there. And then finally, we're moving on to Sony. Now you can imagine these hashes being models, right? Stored in the database or stored however you're getting your data. But for this example, I'm just using hashes to keep it simple. You could create a simple object or something, but again, we'll just keep it simple. We'll do consoles and we'll map the manufacturer. Or sorry, we'll map the name. We'll see how that works. Oh, sorry, that needs to be a pretzel. So that little map object should select all the names of the objects and include them in the why did that work? We'll just do regular map. We'll do console and we'll do name. Run that again. Hope that it passes. So it does. So there we go. We're just going to return the console names and keep it simple. Now we're going to do another test, and we're going to say it supports specifying consoles for a specific manufacturer. And this will let us test making a request that includes params. So if we do params, which is available in RSpec as one of the parameter options in the actual get method call, we'll do manufacturer Nintendo. And what we're going to say is that we expect the JSON body to only include consoles manufactured by Nintendo. So again, we're in a response body, we're going to parse it with JSON, and we'll do expect JSON consoles to contain exactly, because we just want it to be the Nintendo consoles. And it'll be NES, SNES, Wii, Switch. Run it again. We now have two examples. One of them should pass, the other one should fail. The expected elements were what we wrote, right? Just the Nintendo consoles, but what we got were all of them. And that's because we need to actually build the code that does this. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to do something like if params manufacturer present. So if it's specified, we'll make consoles equal to consoles dot select. Select is an enumerable method for Ruby, where we can say select the items in this array if this certain thing is true for this element. So we'll do console manufacturer equals equals params manufacturer. So this is a bit of a long line to read, so I'm going to just change it to the do syntax for the block and make it multi-line. So now if we run this again, hopefully it should pass unless there's a bug. Nope, it passes. So now we have it support for selecting specific consoles based upon the manufacturer. And if we go back to our test, and I'm going to close this route because we're done with it. If we go back to our test, and we could do something like, just to see that it's working, right? It supports, or we could just do it in the same test, why not? We could do manufacturer Sega, and say Sega should just include Genesis, because that's what's in our array. Run it again, still in the same example, but just to make sure we're not fooling anyone, we know that it's actually working. So that passed, which is great. And let's make a few refactorings to just clean up our code and make sure that things are working. So like I mentioned, this JSON equals JSON.parse is kind of, I don't know, it's a bit much, right? Because we're going to be using it all the time. We don't want to define it in every example. So we could pull it out into a let block, which exists in RSpec to put reusable method calls in it. So we could delete it here, save it, and then if we run the spec again, it will hopefully pass. So that's a little bit better, right? Because then in each one we don't have to define JSON. I also don't like that it's called just JSON. I don't think that's it's too general. So what I'm going to do is we're going to rename JSON to response JSON and save it, run it again, make sure it's working. That's the nice thing about writing tests like this, is every time you make a change, just quickly run your tests again to make sure it's working. Let's see, is there anything else I'd change here? Probably not. I think these are pretty fine tests, and it seems to be working. But the other thing is that what about our status spec, right? Where we have JSON.parse here. It'd be nice if we could use this response.json, right? So what we're going to do is we can actually create a module that gets included in all of our tests that can be include methods that just make life a little easier, like this response JSON method. So I usually put those in spec support, and we'll go ahead and we'll create that module. So spec support, we'll call this request helpers.rb. So module request helpers includes methods to make requests, we'll call HTTP request specs easier to work with. I always like to include a little note as to what it's doing. It might be intuitive from the name, but I think it's helpful. We can put more info there as we wanted. So then what we do is we just pull that code out here to a method called response JSON. It'll return JSON.parse of the response body. This would become response JSON. Here, this would actually go away. And then the nifty way to include that code is that in your Rails helper, you can actually just call config.include, and we'll call request helpers. So if you do config.include on the request helpers, it'll include that in all the tests. And you can make that conditional based on the type of test that it is, but we'll go ahead and just make sure that it's for that one. We'll also want to require that file. So if we do support/request helpers, now that should work. Let's do require relative. Hey, there we go. So I think that can just be require relative. So we require the file, and then we include it in all of the tests. And if we run all of our tests and do just bin RSpec, that'll run all three of our examples, we'll see that it passes. So there you go. We've got response JSON here. It's available in all of our different tests that require Rails helper. And we've got three examples that test a Rails API. Now, a few things to note before I end this is that get, just so you have it here for your examples, there's post, there is put, there is delete. So, if you were creating data, deleting data, whatever you're doing, you could then go ahead and just use those methods for your auth if you're ever needing to do authentication. I can cover this more in depth in the future, but I'm pretty sure it looks something like headers. And then within that headers, you can pass in a token or whatever it is your API uses for authentication. I hope this is helpful, and let me know if you have any questions about any of the code or any of the approach, and I'd be happy to help. All of this code is up on GitHub, and links to that will be in the description. Thank you very much.